She had never spoken a single word in her entire life. Not because she couldn't, but because the last time she tried, they tore out everything she loved and called it punishment. She was Omega, the lowest, the forgotten. The girl who kneeled in the snow while wolves in fine cloaks walked past her like she was stone. But there is something glowing inside her palm tonight. Something ancient. Something that has not been seen in 400 years. And the most feared alpha king on the continent, the one they call the Hollow Crown, the one who has never bent his knee to any living soul, is on the ground before her. His hands are clasped, his head is bowed. The entire pack is watching. No one breathes. And she looks at him like she is deciding whether he deserves to live. How did a girl with no voice bring an empire to its knees? The answer will change everything you think you know about silence and about power. Chapter 1. The courtyard was still dark when Silvara began. She always started before the others woke. Before the torches were lit. Before the kitchen fires breathed their first warmth into the cold highland air. Before a single voice broke the silence of Ashvale's morning, Silvara was already on her knees. Her bare hands moved across the stone steps in slow, steady circles. The water in her bucket had gone ice cold an hour ago. She didn't stop. She had learned, a long time ago, that stopping invited attention. And attention, in this pack, was never a gentle thing. Snow fell in thin, lazy curtains around her. It settled on her dark hair, on the curve of her shoulders, on the backs of her reddened hands. She didn't shake it off. She simply worked, quiet and invisible, the way she had always been, the way she had been taught to be. Around her, Ashvale was beginning to stir. She could hear it before she could see it, the distant clatter of the preparation hall, raised voices carrying orders across the upper corridor, the sharp clip of boots on polished stone as Elder Orethus's attendants rushed from one wing to another, arms full of pressed linens and silver candlesticks that hadn't been used since the last summit, 3 years ago. Something important was coming. Silvara had pieced it together the way she pieced most things together, in silence, through observation, from the corners of rooms where no one thought to watch their words around her. She had heard the name last night, muffled through a stone wall, Iron Veil. She had seen the way the senior wolves held their chins a little higher this morning, their spines a little straighter. The way even the youngest pack members had been pulled from their beds early and handed mops and brushes and told without explanation to make this place worthy. Worthy of what? They weren't told. Silvara already knew. She lifted her gaze briefly, just briefly, as Elder Orethus crossed the far end of the courtyard with 2 attendants flanking her like shadow. The old woman moved with the careful precision of someone who had spent decades making sure every step she took looked intentional. Her silver hair was wound tightly at the base of her neck. Her robes were deep charcoal, as they always were. She never wore color. Silvara had always thought that strange a woman who controlled so much, choosing to look like a shadow. Orethus did not look at her as she passed. She never did, and yet Silvara had noticed years ago, as a small child, and again since that Elder Orethus always seemed to know exactly where she was. In a crowded hall, those gray eyes would track briefly to the corner where Silvara stood. At pack gatherings, the old woman would position herself at an angle that kept Silvara in her peripheral line of sight. It was not protection. It was something more unsettling than protection. It was monitoring. Silvara lowered her head and kept scrubbing. The food appeared at her door before sunrise each morning. A rough cloth folded over a small portion bread, sometimes dried meat, occasionally a bruised piece of fruit that no one else had wanted. It was never much. It was always there. She had known for years that it was Feinrich who left it. The pack's young beta moved through Ashvale like someone perpetually braced for an argument he hadn't started. He was broad-shouldered and restless, quick with a sharp word when pack politics demanded it, but Silvara had watched him long enough to know that underneath the performance, he was a man who noticed things he wasn't supposed to notice, and felt responsible for them anyway. He never spoke to her. She never expected him to. But once, 2 winters ago, she had been carrying a load of firewood through the east corridor when she slipped on black ice and scattered the logs across the floor. She had knelt to gather them in the dark, alone, and when she looked up, Feinrich was crouched at the other end of the pile, stacking wood without a word. He didn't meet her eyes. When the last log was collected, he stood, nodded once at the floor, not at her, at the floor, and walked away. He told himself it was pity. Silvara wasn't sure it was only that. She was wringing out her cloth, the morning creeping toward a pale gray dawn, when she heard it, the announcement rolling across the courtyard from the great hall doors, delivered in the clipped, formal tone of Orethus's head steward. His Majesty, King Dorvan Ashkeld of the Iron Vale, will arrive at Ashvale by the 3rd bell of tomorrow evening. The pack will be assembled in formal rank. All members are to present themselves at the main hall by 2nd bell for position assignments. He paused, then added in a slightly lower register, as if the next part required less air. The king's visit is investigative in nature. He is pursuing a matter related to a disappearance recorded 40 years ago. Silence moved through the courtyard like a cold front. Silvara sat very still, water dripping from her cloth to the stone. Across the courtyard, Elder Orethus had stopped walking. The attendants beside her continued for 2 steps before they noticed, and stopped too, turning to look at her. They exchanged a glance. They said nothing. They had learned, in their years of service to the old woman, that there were expressions that did not invite questions. This was one of them. The color had left Orethus's face entirely. Not the pale of cold, not the gray of tiredness. Something deeper. Something that looked, from Silvara's angle, like a woman who had spent 40 years outrunning a particular moment and had just heard its footsteps at the door. Silvara watched her, and for reasons she could not name, could not speak, could not explain even to herself, her palm began to burn. Chapter 2. There was a memory Silvara returned to sometimes, not by choice. She was perhaps 4 years old and it small enough that the world was mostly knees and shadows. She was standing in a stone room she did not recognize, and a woman whose face she could never quite assemble was kneeling in front of her, pressing something cold and wet to her throat. The woman's hands were shaking. Her eyes were red. She was saying something, over and over, in a voice too low and too desperate to be a lullaby, but it had the rhythm of one. Then the cold spread downward, through Silvara's chest, into her stomach, into the soles of her feet, and everything went very quiet. Not the quiet of sleep, the quiet of something being removed. She always woke from that memory the same way, gasping slightly, one hand pressed to her own throat, heart steady, never panicked, just aware of an absence. The way you might press your tongue to the gap where a tooth used to be. She had tried, when she was young, to speak. She had opened her mouth and pushed air through the right shapes, and felt the intention of words forming, and nothing had come. Not silence exactly. Something more absolute than silence. As if sound simply did not apply to her. As if her voice existed somewhere outside her body, just beyond reach, sealed behind something she had no key for. Elder Orethus had told her once, flatly, that she had been born this way. Silvara had believed her for a long time. She wasn't sure she believed her anymore. The gathering was called at midday. All of Ashvale's wolves assembled in the great hall, ranked, as always, from highest to lowest. The senior wolves filling the carved benches near the fire, while the lower-ranked members pressed into the back corners. Silvara stood at the outermost edge, near the door, where the draught was sharpest and the torchlight barely reached. She preferred it there. The edges gave her the fullest view. Elder Orethus stood at the head of the hall and spoke at length about the king's arrival, about the honor it represented, about the importance of presenting Ashvale as a pack of strength, of discipline, of order. Her voice was measured and commanding, the voice of a woman who had never once in her life doubted that a room belonged to her. Silvara watched the faces around her while Orethus spoke. She had learned more from faces than from words. The nervous tightening around the eyes of the senior wolves when Orethus mentioned the investigative nature of the visit. The way 2 of the elder council members glanced at each other for exactly 1 second too long, when the words 40 years entered the air. She catalogued all of it. She did not know yet what she would do with what she collected. She only knew that understanding was the one territory no one had thought to take from her. Kalivra found her after the formal address, when the gathering had dissolved into the low roar of anxious conversation. She always found her. That was the architecture of it, the inevitability. Kalivra was Orethus's granddaughter in face as well as manner. Tall, fine-boned, with the practiced cruelty of someone who had been told since childhood that power was their inheritance, and anyone below them existed to confirm it. She cut through the crowd with 2 of her companions flanking her, and the path she took led directly, deliberately, to Silvara. "Look," Kalivra announced, loud enough to pull heads around. "The ghost is here. I didn't think they let ghosts attend formal gatherings." Laughter scattered. Silvara did not move. Maybe she came to watch. Kalivra tilted her head, performing curiosity for her audience. Or maybe she came to prove she belongs here. Is that it? She stepped closer. "Shall we let her try? Speak up if you belong here, Omega. Go on. Say something." The room shifted that particular ugly stillness that gathers when a crowd senses permission to enjoy someone else's pain. Silvara looked at Kalivra the way she looked at everything, steadily, from a great distance, as if she were watching weather move across a valley. That stillness, that absence of breaking, was the thing Kalivra could not stand. She grabbed Silvara's hand. The intention was clear. Force her to the ground. Make the kneeling visible and public. Give the crowd their performance. Kalivra's fingers closed around Silvara's left hand, the wrapped one, and she pulled downward. Every torch in the hall went out. Not one. Not a few. Every torch. Every candle. Every coal in the fire extinguished in the same instant, as if the room exhaled. As if the dark had been waiting just outside and stepped through all at once. The cold that followed was immediate and complete. For 3 seconds, the great hall of Ashvale was absolutely silent in absolute dark. Then the torches returned. All of them, together, as suddenly as they had left. The fire roared back in the hearth. Kalivra had released Silvara's hand. She was standing 2 feet back. Silvara had not seen her step away. No one had, and her face had rearranged itself into something she was working very hard to make look like contempt. It was not contempt. Silvara recognized what it actually was, because she had seen it once before, on a different face, in a cold courtyard at dawn. No one spoke. No one laughed. No one mentioned what had just happened. The crowd simply resumed. Gradually, carefully, like water finding its way around a stone it didn't want to acknowledge. Silvara lowered her hand to her side. From across the hall, Elder Orithis was looking at her. Not with the cold management of a woman watching a problem she has contained. Not with the flat dismissal she offered Silvara in every room, every corridor, every year of her life. She was looking at Silvara the way a person looks at something they have spent 40 years hoping would never happen. Her face was naked with it, stripped of every careful layer. What lived underneath was not contempt. It was terror. Chapter 3. They had expected someone older. That was the first thing Silvara noticed from her position at the edge of the courtyard. The collective recalibration that moved through the assembled pack the moment King Dorvan Ashkeld rode through Ashvale's iron gates. A subtle thing, a straightening of assumptions. The senior wolves had prepared themselves for the kind of authority that announces itself through age and decoration, through the visible accumulation of power worn like armor. What came through the gate instead was a man in his early 30s, dark-haired, broad-shouldered, dressed in traveling clothes of deep charcoal wool that bore no insignia beyond a single iron clasp at his collar, no crown, no ceremonial cloak. His delegation rode behind him in disciplined silence, 12 riders, all of them carrying the quiet particular to people who had learned that the most dangerous rooms were the quiet ones. He dismounted without ceremony, handing his reins to a groom without looking at him, and surveyed the assembled welcome with the calm, unhurried gaze of a man completing an obligation he had completed many times before. Elder Orethis moved forward to receive him. She had spent 2 days preparing this moment, every word, every bow, every careful arrangement of bodies designed to project strength and composure. She delivered it flawlessly. Dorvan Ashkeld listened. He nodded at the correct intervals. He said the correct things in return, gracious, measured, neither warm nor cold. His eyes moved across the gathered pack with systematic thoroughness, the way a man reads a room not for pleasure but for information. He was, Silvara thought, very good at being present without being reachable. She recognized the technique. She had spent 17 years practicing a version of it herself. His wolf was a different matter. Silvara could not have explained how she knew. She had no formal training in reading the inner states of dominant wolves she had been given, no education beyond what she had stolen from observation. But there was something in the way Dorvan held his shoulders, a tension that had nothing to do with the formality of the occasion. A quality of alertness that exceeded what a welcome ceremony in a mid-tier Highland pack should reasonably demand. He was looking for something, not performing the search, actually conducting it beneath the pleasantries, beneath the correct nods and measured responses. His attention was moving through this courtyard like a hand moving through water, feeling for a shape it had been told was here somewhere. His beta, a lean, watchful man, who had not left his king's left side since they arrived, noticed it too. Silvara saw him notice, saw the slight tightening around his eyes as he tracked his king's distraction, and filed it without comment. Whatever Dorvan Ashkeld had come to Ashvale to find, he had not found it yet in the arranged faces of the welcoming committee. Silvara shifted the water yoke across her shoulders and turned to cross to the east corridor. She was halfway across the courtyard when it happened. She became aware of him the way she became aware of most things peripherally at first, then with gathering certainty, the shift in the air, the particular weight of attention that is different from a glance. She had felt the gaze of people who looked through her for 17 years, and she knew, with the precision of long practice, when someone was looking at her instead. She turned her head. He had stopped walking, not slowed. Stopped completely, mid-stride, mid-sentence. Whatever he had been saying to his beta abandoned between one word and the next. He was looking at her from across the courtyard with an expression that had no performance in it whatsoever. The careful composure he had maintained through the entire welcome had simply, without warning, without apparent cause, vacated his face. What was left underneath was something unguarded and slightly stunned. Silvara did not look away. This was not defiance. She had no interest in defiance. Defiance required caring what people thought of her reactions, and she had long since stopped. She held his gaze the way she held everything difficult, steadily, from behind something quiet and deep, with the patience of a person who had learned that most things, if you waited long enough, revealed themselves. He looked like a man who had just heard a sound he thought he would never hear again. She did not know what to do with that, so she did the only sensible thing. She walked on. She did not look back. She carried the water into the east corridor, set it down beside the kitchen door, pressed her back briefly against the cold stone wall and breathed. Her palm was warm. She pressed it flat against the stone until the warmth faded. Then she picked up the empty yoke and went back to work. The castle settled into a restless quiet long after the third bell. Dorvan Ashkeld sat at the writing desk in his assigned chamber and did not write anything. The fire across the room was the only sound, the low, irregular conversation of burning wood. He had dismissed everyone an hour ago. His beta had gone with visible reluctance. He sat with the particular stillness of a man holding a thought still so he could examine it without startling it away. His wolf had not been restless since he crossed the courtyard. It was the opposite of restless now. It was focused. When the quiet knock came at his door just after midnight, he said, "Enter," without turning. His most trusted advisor, a slight, silver-templed woman named Vesara, who had served him and his father before him, crossed the room and stood at the edge of his lamplight. She had been with him for 20 years. He had never seen her look uncertain. She looked uncertain now. "You asked me to find everything on the girl," she said, the mute Omega. "I did." A pause. Vesara pressed her lips together once, a habit she had only when she was organizing something she didn't want to say. "Sire," her voice was careful and even, "there is nothing to find." He turned then. "She has no pack record, no rank assignment, no birth documentation, no intake record from any surrounding territory." Vesara met his eyes. "I searched every registry we carry and sent 2 writers to the pack archive. She is not in it, not a single page, not her name, not a description, nothing." The fire crackled once in the silence. "She has lived here 17 years, Dorvan said quietly. "Yes. And there is no record of her existing." "No." Vesara's voice dropped slightly. "Sire, it is not that the records are incomplete. Someone made her disappear from them. Thoroughly, deliberately." She paused. "That takes considerable effort, and access." Dorvan turned back to face the fire. His wolf was very, very still. "Get some rest," he said. "Tomorrow we begin again." Vesara left without another word. He sat alone in the lamplight for a long time after a king who had come to Ashvale hunting a ghost from 40 years ago, staring into a fire and wondering why, for the first time in years, his wolf felt like it had finally found the right room. Chapter 4. She had kept it wrapped for as long as she could remember. The cloth was plain undyed linen, wound twice around her left palm, and tucked at the wrist with the practiced efficiency of someone who had performed the same action every morning for years without thinking about it. It was as automatic as breathing, as invisible as everything else about her. Elder Orethus had told her, when she was very small, that it was a burn, that she had been injured as an infant, and the skin had healed wrong. She had said it the way she said most things to Silvara, flatly, without gentleness, but also without the particular edge she used when she wanted to cause pain, almost clinical, almost bored. It is a defect, keep it covered. It is not something others need to see. Silvara had believed her. Or rather, she had accepted the explanation the way she accepted most things in Ashvale, not because it rang true, but because she had nothing to place against it. She was a child with no memory of before, no one to ask, no mirror that showed her anything except what the pack had decided she was. The mark itself she had examined only rarely, and always alone, always briefly. It sat in the center of her left palm, not the ragged, puckered texture of scar tissue, not the flat discoloration of a burn. It was a sigil, precise and deliberate, like something pressed into wax with a seal, a pattern of interlocking lines that curved and crossed each other, with the kind of geometry that suggested intention rather than accident. And in the cold, it glowed. Faintly, the soft, blue-white luminescence of moonlight through ice. She had never told anyone. She had understood, without being told, that the glowing was the part that mattered most to keep hidden. The ice was in the North Passage. It had formed overnight in a thin, treacherous sheet across the flagstones, the kind that looked like wet stone until the moment it didn't. Silvara had taken that passage 1,000 times. She knew every uneven joint in the floor, every draft from the upper window that turned puddles to glass by morning. She still went down. The water bucket caught the wall. The linen wrapping on her left hand snagged the edge of a stone as she caught herself, and when she pushed herself upright, she felt it immediately. The loosening, the unwinding, 3 turns of cloth falling slack from her wrist, the knot pulling free. She reached to rewrap it, and found Feinrich standing at the far end of the passage. He had come around the corner at exactly the wrong moment. Or the right one. She would think about that distinction later. He was carrying a lantern, clearly heading toward the outer stores, and he had stopped with the involuntary stillness of someone who had seen something before they could decide not to. His eyes were on her hand. The mark was fully exposed, and the passage was cold enough that it was doing what it did in the cold. The light from her palm was soft, barely more than a shimmer, barely brighter than the lantern between them. But in the dimness of the North Passage, at that distance, there was absolutely no mistaking it for a burn, no mistaking it for a defect or a scar or anything that belonged to the category of ordinary. It was a living thing, patient and precise and completely impossible. Feinrich looked at it for 3 full seconds. Then he looked at Silvara's face. She held his gaze and waited, the cloth hanging loose at her wrist, and let him decide what to do with what he was seeing. She had long since stopped trying to manage other people's reactions to the things she could not control. He said nothing. He walked past her without a word, turned the corner, and was gone. She rewrapped her hand in the dark and continued to the kitchen. Feinrich went to the archive that same afternoon. The pack's historical records occupied the lower east wing, 3 rooms of shelving that smelled of age and neglect, maintained by a single elderly archivist who was largely deaf and largely indifferent to who came and went. Feinrich told himself he was looking for the quartermaster's inventory from the previous winter. He had the lie prepared before he crossed the threshold. He did not need it. The archivist was asleep at his desk. Feinrich moved through the shelving with his lantern held low, past the bound ledgers of pack census records, and the rolled maps of territorial boundaries, and the water-damaged registers of rank assignments going back 200 years. He did not know precisely what he was looking for. He only knew the shape of the feeling that had been sitting in his chest since the North Passage, the particular discomfort of a man who has recognized something he cannot yet name. He found it in the 4th room. A historical text, crumbling at its spine, shelved between 2 equally neglected volumes on Highland territorial law. The cover was plain. The title, faded to near illegibility, read simply, "On the Bloodlines, a record of the great houses before the severance." He almost put it back. He opened it instead. The pages were fragile and brown at the edges. the illustrations rendered in faded ink that had once been precise. He turned through chapters on houses he half-recognized names that survived in fragments of pack history, referenced obliquely, their full stories swallowed by the rewriting that always followed conquest. He found the illustration on page 47. It occupied half the page. A single sigil interlocking lines that curved and crossed with deliberate, unmistakable geometry. Beneath it, in script still dark enough to read, a single line of text. The Lunaris sigil, carried in the flesh of the pale bloodline, given at birth, cannot be forged, cannot be removed. Feinrich's lantern was very steady in his hand. He was making sure of that deliberately. He read the facing page, then the page after. Then he went back to the beginning of the chapter and read it all again, slowly, with the care of a man who understands that what he is reading will not become less true the second time through. The Pale Bloodline. The original dynasty, the first ruling house of all, werewolf kind, predating every pack structure currently in existence. Overthrown 4 centuries ago, in a coordinated massacre so complete, so deliberate in its erasure, that within 2 generations, most wolves alive had been raised to believe the bloodline had simply ended, that there were no survivors, that history had moved on cleanly, as history preferred to do. There had been one survivor, an infant girl removed from the palace in the hours before it fell, smuggled across the Highland border by a pack scout whose name the record did not give, never found, never confirmed dead, simply gone. Feinrich sat on the floor of the archive with the book in his lap and the lantern beside him, and he did not move for a very long time. Outside, Asheville carried on its evening. Fires were lit. Supper was served. The pack moved through its familiar architecture of rank and routine, entirely unaware that in a dusty room in the East Wing, a beta was sitting very still with the weight of 4 centuries pressing down on his chest. He thought about going to Arethus. He sat with that option for a long time, turned it over, examined it from every angle available to him. Then he thought about a girl who had no records. A girl who had lived 17 years in a pack that treated her like furniture. A girl who had been told her entire life that the thing she carried in her palm was a defect, something shameful, something to hide. He closed the book. He picked up his lantern. And he walked, with the deliberate steadiness of a man who has chosen a direction and intends to follow it regardless of what it costs him, toward the guest wing of Ashevale, toward the set of rooms assigned to King Dorvan Ashkeld of the Iron Vale. Chapter 5. She had not slept properly in 3 days. This was not unusual when politics demanded vigilance. Orethus had gone longer without sleep during territorial disputes, during succession crises, during the slow and careful work of managing things that could not be allowed to become visible. She knew how to function in the gray space between exhaustion and clarity. She had built her entire life in that space. But this was different. This was the particular wakefulness of a woman who had spent 40 years constructing a wall, stone by careful stone, and had just heard something moving on the other side of it. She sat at the edge of her bed in the deep quiet of midnight, still fully dressed, her hands folded in her lap with the deliberate composure of someone performing stillness for an audience that was not there. The candles on her writing desk were burning low. The fire had gone to embers. She had not moved to tend either. She was thinking about a road. 40 years ago, Orethus had been 26. Young enough to believe that the orders given by powerful men were simply the shape of the world. Old enough to understand exactly what she was being asked to do and choose, consciously, to accept it. She had been a pack scout then, fast, discreet, reliable. Those were the qualities that had brought the commission to her door, rather than someone else's. A sealed envelope, a meeting in a room with no windows, a bundle wrapped in traveling cloth, already sleeping, already quiet. Take it across the Highland border, they had said. Past the Third Ridge, away from any settlement. You understand what we are asking. She had understood. The gold had been considerable. The title Elder, accelerated, granted before she had the years to earn it through ordinary means, had been more considerable still. She had accepted both with the clean hands of a woman who had convinced herself that clean hands were a matter of perspective. She had carried the bundle for 2 days. On the third morning, in the gray light before dawn, she had stopped on the road and looked down at what she was carrying. The infant had woken somewhere in the night, and was looking up at her with dark, solemn eyes, not crying, not frightened, simply watching, with the particular, unnerving steadiness of a child who seemed to understand far more than an infant should. Her left palm, even then, had carried the mark. Even then, barely weeks old, it had glowed faintly in the cold morning air. Orethys had stood on that road for a very long time. She had told herself, in the 40 years since, that she didn't know why she hadn't done it, that it had been a moment of weakness, sentiment, the irrational pull of something biological and inconvenient that she had otherwise spent her life keeping carefully managed. She had never quite believed that explanation. The truth, the one she kept in the room inside herself, that she never voluntarily entered, was simpler and more damning. She had looked at that child and felt, for one unguarded moment, the full weight of what she was being asked to do. Not the political weight, the human weight, and she had found that she could not lift it. So she had made a different choice, and then spent 4 decades making sure that choice never became visible. She had brought the infant to Ashvale by a route no one used, registered her as a foundling, rank undetermined, the lowest possible classification, the one that invited the least scrutiny. She had positioned herself as Silvara's reluctant custodian in the way a person claims a stray, with visible reluctance, with conspicuous indifference, with enough distance to maintain deniability if anyone ever came asking. No one had come asking. Until now. The suppressant ritual she had administered in the child's first year had been the hardest part. Not emotionally, she had not allowed herself the luxury of emotional difficulty. Practically, the ritual required a practitioner with knowledge most modern wolves no longer carried, and acquiring that knowledge without explaining why she needed it had taken careful work. It had functioned as intended. The Lunaris power, whatever it was, whatever ancient and incomprehensible thing lived in that bloodline, had gone dormant. The voice that carried it had sealed. The child had grown into a girl who was silent and unranked, and invisible to anyone who might have recognized what she carried. Orethys had told herself it was mercy. The child would live. She would simply never become what she was born to be. She would exist in a smaller life, a quieter life, and that was an act of preservation, not cruelty. She had told herself that for 17 years. She was finding it harder to tell herself tonight, because the mark was glowing again. She had seen it briefly, at a distance, in the courtyard 2 days ago when Silvara didn't know she was being watched. The wrapping had shifted, just for a moment, just enough. The suppressant was weakening, and the king of the Iron Veil was sleeping 40 feet down the corridor, having arrived specifically to investigate the disappearance that Orethys had spent 40 years ensuring remained only a disappearance. She stood from the edge of her bed and crossed to the window. Below, Ashvale's courtyard was empty and still, dusted with fresh snow that held the blue cast of a moonless sky. She pressed one hand against the cold glass and looked at nothing in particular. I kept you alive. The thought arrived the way it always did, not as comfort, but as argument. The only defense she had ever constructed, the one she returned to when everything else felt insufficient. She said it aloud this time, barely above a whisper. To the dark courtyard, to the empty room, to no one. I kept you alive. Isn't that enough? The candles went out. All 4 of them, together, in the same instant. No draft, no guttering, no warning. Simply gone, between one breath and the next, as if something in the room had decided they were no longer necessary. The darkness was absolute and immediate. Orethys stood very still at the window, her hand still pressed against the glass, the cold working its way through her palm. No one answered her question. But the silence that followed was not empty. It had a quality to it, a weight, a presence, the particular texture of something that has heard you and chosen, deliberately and precisely, not to offer you absolution. She stood in it for a long time. Then she walked to her desk in the dark, sat down, and began, for the first time in 40 years, to think about what came next when a wall finally ran out of stones. Chapter 6. Finric had chosen the East Garden. It was a practical choice removed enough from the main hall to avoid the constant traffic of pack members performing their best selves for the royal delegation, but open enough that no one could accuse him of arranging anything clandestine, a beta escorting a servant to deliver morning refreshments to a guest taking air. Unremarkable. forgettable. He had rehearsed the pretense 3 times before he'd gone to find Silvara. She had looked at him when he appeared at the kitchen threshold, looked at him with those steady dark eyes that always made him feel faintly transparent, and he had said, quietly and without preamble, "Come with me. There is someone who needs to see you." He had not said, "I found something in the archive last night that I have not slept since reading." He had not said, "I believe you are the most important person in this building, and possibly in this territory, and I am not entirely sure what to do with that." He had simply held the door open. She had come. Dorvin was standing at the far edge of the east garden when they arrived, his back to them, his hands clasped behind him, looking out over the snow-covered expanse of the lower grounds. He had accepted Feinrich's request for a brief audience, with the kind of quiet attention that suggested he had been expecting something, not this specifically, but something since the previous night. He turned when he heard their approach. Feinrich said, with the careful neutrality of a man executing a plan he wasn't certain would survive contact with reality, "Sire, this is Silvara. She assists in the household." Then he stepped back. He was not sure he was supposed to witness what came next. He stayed anyway. The distance between them was perhaps 10 feet of snow-dusted stone. Dorvin looked at Silvara. Silvara looked at Dorvin. It was not the moment in the courtyard that had been brief, unguarded, a collision at a distance. This was slower. This was 2 people in the same space, with nothing between them but cold air and the soft sound of wind moving through the bare branches at the garden's edge. His wolf went still. Not the restless, searching stillness of the past 2 days. Something categorically different. The way a compass needle stops moving when it finally finds north, not because it has given up, but because it no longer needs to search. He felt it in his chest like a held breath, like the moment before a very important word. He had no framework for it. He set that aside and focused on what was in front of him. She was smaller than he'd registered from a distance. Dark-haired, dark-eyed, her left hand wrapped in plain linen to the wrist. She was dressed in the rough, practical clothing of pack labor, nothing that had been given with any care, nothing that fit particularly well. And yet she stood with a quality that had nothing to do with clothing or rank or the deliberate posturing of dominance. She simply occupied her own space completely, without apology, without performance. He had met queens who could not manage that. Silvara, for her part, was experiencing something she had no name for. It had begun the moment she came within 10 feet of him, a sensation in her throat. Not pain, not the familiar blankness of sealed silence. Something underneath that. A vibration, low and continuous, like a string that had been wound too tightly for too long, and was beginning, very slowly, to remember what it was made to do. She pressed her lips together and breathed carefully through her nose and looked at him. He was looking back at her without the evaluating quality most dominant wolves brought to every interaction. Without the reflexive cataloging of rank and threat and utility, he was simply looking at her, with the full weight of his attention, undiluted and unperformed. It was, she realized with a distant shock, the first time in her life she had been looked at that way. Like a person who was entirely there. Dorvin spoke first. He had found, in the 30 seconds since she'd arrived, that the careful, formal register he used for every other interaction in this building had become unavailable to him. What came out instead was quieter, more direct. "I'm told you've been here 17 years, he said. She held his gaze. Nodded once. "And before that?" She held his gaze, said nothing. Her expression did not apologize for the silence. He nodded slowly, as if she had answered. Perhaps she had. He was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, the question arrived without preamble, without the social architecture that usually surrounded the things people actually wanted to ask. "Is there something you're trying to remember?" The vibration in her throat intensified. No one had ever asked her that. Not once. Not in 17 years. The world had always proceeded on the assumption that she had nothing inside her worth excavating, that the silence was the whole story, not the surface of one. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she knelt. Not in submission, her spine stayed straight, her eyes stayed level. She knelt the way a person kneels to reach the ground, and she pressed her left hand flat against the snow between them. The linen wrapping had loosened at the wrist, and she did not stop to fix it. She simply pressed her palm down. The glow came immediately, stronger than it had been in the passage, stronger than it had been in the cold courtyard at dawn. The sigil blazed blue-white against the snow, and where the light touched the frost, the crystals moved. Not randomly, with intention. Shapes formed in the frost around her hand, precise, deliberate, unmistakable, to anyone who had seen the writing style of the old Highland courts. Ancient script, pressing itself up through the ice, as if it had always been there, waiting for exactly this temperature, this pressure, this moment. A single name. Dorvin read it. He read it again. The blood left his face so completely and so quickly that Feinrich, watching from the garden's edge, took an involuntary step forward before stopping himself. The name in the frost was Elindra Ashkeld, his grandmother. Dead 30 years. The last queen of the Iron Vale to have crossed the Highland border in peace, seeking an alliance with a bloodline. The history books, now claimed had never existed, killed on her return journey, under circumstances that had never been satisfactorily explained. Dorvin stood. It was a slow movement. The movement of a man whose legs are operating slightly independently of the rest of him. He straightened to his full height and looked down at Silvara, who was looking up at him with those dark, steady eyes, the glow from her palm still illuminating the space between them. When he spoke, his voice had shed every layer of the hollow crown entirely. What was left was barely above a whisper. "You're not just an Omega." The frost held his grandmother's name a moment longer. Then the wind moved across the garden, and the shapes dissolved back into ordinary snow. "You're the reason my family has been searching for 40 years. Silvera did not look away. The vibration in her throat said nothing yet, but for the first time in 17 years, it felt like it was learning how. Chapter 7. Dorvin requested the meeting through official channels. That was the first thing that unsettled Orethus, the formality of it. A king who wanted to intimidate came unannounced, used surprise as leverage, filled a room with the weight of his authority before a single word was spoken. A king who requested a private meeting through his advisor, at a specified hour, in neutral territory, was a king who intended to be precise. Precision, in her experience, was always more dangerous than force. She chose her chair carefully when she arrived, the one that faced the door, the one that gave her the full room. She arranged her robes, she folded her hands. She built herself, in the 4 minutes before he arrived, into the version of Elder Orethus that had survived 4 decades of difficult rooms. Dorvin came in alone. No advisor, no beta, no council member at his shoulder to record or witness. He closed the door behind him, crossed the room without ceremony, and sat in the chair across from her, as if he had always intended to sit there, as if the room had been arranged for him specifically, and he was simply arriving to confirm it. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. Then he placed a single, folded document on the table between them. "The Lunaris Sigil," he said. "Page 47 of a historical text currently shelved in your pack archive. I had it retrieved this morning." Orethus looked at the document. She did not touch it. "I'm also in possession," he continued, in the same level tone, "of testimony from 2 of my council members who spoke last night with your pack's beta regarding what he found in that archive. And I have the account of my own advisor, who spent yesterday searching every territorial registry for a record of a girl named Silvara, and found nothing." He paused. "Nothing," he said again, quietly. 17 years, not 1 page. Orethus said nothing. She was watching him the way she watched everything dangerous, completely still, giving away nothing, waiting to understand the full shape of what she was facing before she decided how to respond. He let the silence sit between them for a long moment. He seemed in no hurry. "I'm not here to perform this," he said at last. "I'm not going to present evidence, and watch you deny it, and present more evidence, and watch you recalibrate. We are both too old for that, and she has waited long enough." He leaned forward slightly. "Tell me what you did, all of it, from the beginning." She told him. Not immediately, not without resistance. The first several minutes were a careful rearguard action, partial acknowledgments wrapped in justification, truths shaped so precisely around their edges that they functioned almost like denials. She had spent 40 years becoming very good at that particular architecture. He dismantled it without raising his voice. Every time she offered a shaped truth, he placed a question beside it that required a real one. Every time she reached for justification, he waited, patiently, until the justification ran out of air. He did not argue. He did not accuse. He simply refused to accept anything less than the actual shape of what had happened, and he made that refusal feel inevitable, rather than aggressive. The composure went in layers. By the time she reached the suppressant ritual, the practitioner she had found, the administration in the child's first year, the specific intention of keeping the Lunaris power sealed and silent, her hands, folded on the table, had stopped being still. When she finished, the room was very quiet. Dorvin sat back. He looked at her with an expression that was not anger. Anger would have been easier to receive. It was something more considered than anger, more final. You made her invisible to protect her, he said, and you told yourself it was love. Orethys opened her mouth, but you never once asked her what she wanted. His voice remained even, quiet, each word placed with the care of someone who intends them to be carried a long distance. You decided what she could survive. You decided what she was allowed to become. You sealed the thing that made her herself, and called it mercy. He paused. You stole her voice twice. Once with ritual, once with silence. The room offered nothing to fill the space after that. Orethys found, to her considerable disturbance, that she had no architecture left. Every structure she had built around this truth over 40 years had been taken apart piece by careful piece, and what remained was just the truth itself, sitting in plain air, unhoused and undefended. She said nothing. There was nothing left that was worth saying. Word moved through the delegation faster than Orethys had anticipated. By the time she returned to her own wing, 2 of Dorvin's senior council members had already been in conference for an hour. Feinrich, she was told by a pale-faced attendant, had been with them. The archive text had been formally logged as evidence. The territorial registries had been formally noted as deliberately incomplete. The machinery of consequence had begun to turn. She sat in her chamber and listened to the distant, muffled sounds of it, and understood, with the clarity that comes only when there is nothing left to manage, that 40 years of careful construction had taken less than 48 hours to come apart. Silvara found the book before supper. Finric had left it open on the reading table in the archive's inner room, not hidden, not ceremonially arranged, simply open, at page 47, as if someone had been reading and stepped away, as if it were waiting for the next reader to simply arrive and continue. She sat down in front of it. She read slowly. She had taught herself to read from discarded documents and old pack notices and the spines of books in rooms she was supposed to be cleaning carefully, privately, a skill she had never revealed, because revealed skills invited questions about what else she might be capable of. She read the page, then the facing page, then the chapter from the beginning. She read about the pale bloodline. She read about the massacre. She read about the infant smuggled across the border, last confirmed location, the Highland Territories, and never found. She looked at her left palm for a long time. Then she looked at the illustration, the sigil, rendered in faded ink, precise and deliberate, a pattern she had carried in her own flesh, since before she had words for anything. And something shifted. Not revelation, she had been moving toward this understanding since the East Garden, since the frost had written a dead queen's name under her hand. This was not surprise. This was the moment after surprise, when the full weight of a thing finally lands. What landed was not power, not destiny, not the grand, clarifying rush of finally knowing who she was. What landed was fury, quiet and vast and completely, searingly focused. Not at Orethys alone, not at the pack, not at the wolves who had walked past her for 17 years without once asking if she was anything more than what they'd decided she was. The fury was bigger than any single target. It was the fury of someone who had been handed a story about themselves, defect, burden, ghost, nobody, and had lived inside it, carefully, for 17 years, because she had been given nothing to place against it. No other version, no evidence of an alternative. Only the shape of the cage, presented as the shape of the world. She stood up from the table. Her hands were shaking not with fear, with the effort of containing something that was rapidly becoming larger than containment. The vibration in her throat that had begun in the East Garden had returned. Stronger now, insistent. It rose through her chest and filled the column of her neck, and pressed against the seal that had held it for 17 years, the ritual that had been administered without her knowledge, without her consent, before she had the capacity to refuse it, and she felt, for the first time, what the seal actually was. Not silence. A lock. And fury, it turned out, was a key. She opened her mouth. The sound that came was barely a sound, a breath with a shape, a whisper that had no real volume to it. Her own name. Silvara. One word. Her word. The only word she had ever owned without being given it, without being allowed it, without having to earn it in a pack that had decided she was worth nothing. The windows of the archive cracked. Not broke, cracked. A network of fine fractures, spreading from the center of each pane outward, like frost forming in fast motion, like something very old and very compressed, finally finding room to breathe. Silvara stood in the dust and the dim lamplight with her own name still vibrating in her throat, and for the first time in 17 years, the silence inside her was not empty. It was ending. Chapter 8. Orethys had called the assembly at first light. She had moved quickly, that much Silvara could see from the narrow window of the east corridor, where she had stood since before dawn, watching the courtyard fill. The elder had spent the pre-dawn hours doing what she had always done when something threatened to escape her management. She had built a structure around it. A formal review, announced through official pack channels, framed in the precise language of Highland pack law, grievance proceedings, questions of jurisdiction, the orderly, procedural machinery of authority asserting itself before the ground fully shifted beneath it. It was, Silvara thought, a very good plan. The pack had assembled in rank formation, the way they always did for formal proceedings. Senior wolves at the front near the hall steps, the middle tiers filling the courtyard's center, the lower-ranked members pressed toward the outer edges, where the cold was sharpest and the view was worst. Dorvan's delegation stood to one side in a separate cluster, their stillness, a different quality from the pack's nervous formality. Watching rather than participating. Waiting. Orethys stood at the top of the hall steps with her council arranged behind her. She had dressed carefully, every silver hair in place, robes without a crease. The full architecture of elder authority assembled and presented for the courtyard to receive. She had a speech prepared. Silvara could tell from the way she held herself the slight elevation of the chin, the particular set of the shoulders that meant words were cued and ready. She did not get to deliver it. The great hall door opened. Not the main doors, the side entrance, the servants' door, the one that opened directly onto the courtyard's eastern edge, the one that had no ceremonial significance, the one that no one of rank had ever used to make an entrance because it was, by the unspoken agreement of every wolf in Ashvale, not an entrance. It was a passage for those who did not merit entrances. Silvara walked through it alone. No escort, no announcement, nothing preceding her except the sound of the latch and the quiet press of her boots on the snow-dusted stone. She wore the same plain clothes she always wore. Her left hand was unwrapped bare, the sigil visible in the cold morning air, glowing with the soft, steady luminescence that the cold always drew from it. She had not bound it this morning. She had looked at the linen cloth on her floor and left it there. She walked to the center of the courtyard and stopped. The assembly had gone very quiet. Not the quiet of respect, the deeper quiet of a crowd that has encountered something that does not fit the category it has prepared for. They had arranged themselves to receive a formal proceeding. What was standing in front of them did not resemble a formal proceeding. It resembled something older, something that had no comfortable slot in the architecture of their mourning. Orethys, at the top of the steps, had gone still. Her prepared speech, Silvara suspected, had just become unavailable to her. Silvara opened her mouth. She had not planned what to say. She had stood in the east corridor since before dawn, turning possibilities over accusations, declarations, the formal language of blood right and dynastic claim that she had read about in the archive text. All of it had felt like someone else's costume. All of it had felt like putting on the performance of power, rather than the actual thing. What came out instead was a question. Her voice was rough. 17 years of silence had left it with no smoothness, no training, no learned projection. It shook on the first syllable, and steadied slightly on the second, and arrived in the cold air of the courtyard, like something that had traveled a very long distance to get there. Did any of you ever wonder? She paused, breathed, let the shaking settle into something she could use. Why you were so certain I had nothing to say? The question moved through the courtyard like a stone through still water. The silence that followed was not the silence of a crowd waiting for more. It was the silence of a crowd that has just been handed a mirror they were not prepared to look into. The silence of people who were, in real time, encountering a question they could not answer without also encountering what the answer revealed about them. No one laughed. There was no performance of contempt, no reflexive reassertion of rank and certainty. The machinery that had always activated in Silvara's presence, the casual dismissal, the easy cruelty of people who had never once questioned whether their certainty was earned, that machinery did not engage. It simply had nothing to run on. Kalivra, standing 3 rows back, looked at the ground. Orethis, at the top of the steps, said nothing. Her mouth had closed around whatever she had been about to say. Her hands, at her sides, were very still. The courtyard held its breath. The main doors opened. Dorvin came through them alone, no delegation, no counsel, no advisor at his shoulder. He had dressed with the quiet formality of a man who understood the weight of what he was about to do and had decided to meet it plainly. The iron clasp at his collar, the dark wool. Nothing ceremonial. Nothing that announced itself. He crossed the hall steps without acknowledging Orethis. He crossed the courtyard without acknowledging the assembled pack. His eyes were on Silvara. He walked until he was standing directly in front of her, close enough that she could see the steadiness in his face, the complete absence of performance, the quality she had first recognized in the East Garden. A man who had arrived at a decision and was done deliberating about it. He stopped. And then King Dorvin Ashkeld of the Iron Veil, the Hollow Crown, the most feared Alpha King on the continent, a man who had never in his documented reign bent his knee to any living soul, went down. One knee meeting snow, both hands clasped in front of him, his head bowed. The posture was not romantic. It was not gestural. It had the precise, formal quality of something ancient and legal, the specific acknowledgement of blood right, of dynastic recognition, of a debt being formally named after 400 years of accumulation. The courtyard did not breathe. Dorvin raised his head. He did not stand. He spoke from where he was, from the snow, from the position of acknowledgement, so that every wolf in the assembled pack and every member of his own delegation heard it with equal clarity. The pale bloodline is not extinct. His voice carried the way voices carry when they have nothing to prove. She is standing in front of you. He held Silvara's gaze across the cold air between them, this girl who had scrubbed stone steps in the dark, who had been made invisible by design, who had spoken her first word to cracking glass in a dusty room, and walked through a servant's door to stand in a courtyard full of people who had spent 17 years looking through her. And I owe her a debt, Dorvin said, that my kingdom has owed for 4 centuries. The snow between them caught the light from her palm and held it. Above the assembled pack, Elder Orethis stood at the top of her steps with her prepared speech dissolved, and her 40 years of careful construction, visible at last for what it had always been, not a wall, not protection, not mercy, just a delay. And delays, Silvara was learning, always ended. Chapter 9. By evening, Ashvale had the particular quality of a place that has survived something, and has not yet decided what to do with the survival. The pack moved through its routines with the careful, slightly dazed energy of people performing normalcy as a way of postponing the larger reckoning. Fires were lit. Supper was prepared. Voices stayed low. The courtyard, which had held its breath all morning, now simply held its quiet, the different, heavier quiet of a space where something irrevocable had occurred, and the air had not yet finished absorbing it. Orethis had been remanded to council custody before midday. The formal language had been precise and procedural, delivered by Dorvin's senior advisor in the measured tone of someone reading from a document that already existed, as if the outcome had been inevitable long before the morning's assembly, as if the courtyard had simply been the last place it needed to be confirmed. Orethis had gone without resistance. She had walked with her spine straight and her hands at her sides, and she had not looked at Silvara as she passed. Feinrich had disappeared into the northern wing sometime in the afternoon. Silvara did not go looking for him. She understood, in the way she understood most things about him, obliquely, through observation, through the language of small actions rather than spoken ones, that he needed to be alone with what he had set in motion. He had pulled a thread and watched 40 years unravel in 48 hours, and that kind of reckoning required its own particular silence. She found a bench at the edge of the east garden as the light failed. She sat in it the way she had sat in difficult moments her entire life, without drama, without the performance of composure, simply present with the weight of the thing. The cold was considerable. She did not move to go inside. She was so tired that tiredness had become something else, something past the reach of sleep, the kind of exhaustion that lives in the bones, in the architecture of a person, in the specific accumulation of years spent being smaller than you were. She sat with it, and she waited, and after a while she heard footsteps on the stone path. Dorvin did not ask if he could sit. He simply sat on the other end of the bench, at a distance that was neither crowding nor pointed, leaving the space between them as neutral territory. He had shed his formal bearing somewhere between the courtyard and here. What he brought to the bench was quieter, less structured. A man rather than a king, which Silvara suspected required more effort from him than the reverse. He said nothing immediately. Neither did she. The garden settled around them, bare branches, blue dusk, the first stars beginning to assert themselves above the highland ridgeline. When Silvara spoke, her voice was still rough at the edges, still finding the shape of itself. But it came more readily than it had in the courtyard, without the same seismic effort, as if the morning had broken something open, and the opening, while exhausting, had made passage easier. "I don't want it," she said. He turned his head slightly toward her, but did not interrupt. "What you offered this morning." She looked at her hands in her lap, both of them, the marked one and the plain one. The title, the claim, the 400 years of history that apparently belong to me now. She paused. "I understand why it matters to you. I understand the politics of it. I'm not saying it isn't real." Another pause, shorter. "I'm saying I woke up yesterday as someone who scrubbed stone steps. I don't know how to be what you described in that courtyard, and I'm not sure I want to learn on someone else's timeline." Dorvin was quiet for a moment. He did not reassure her. He did not explain why she was wrong, or outline the reasons the bloodline required her cooperation, or enumerate the ways her reluctance was a luxury. The political situation could not accommodate. She had half expected one of those responses had steeled herself, quietly, for the particular disappointment of a man who had knelt in the snow and meant something by it, and then revealed, in the privacy of evening, that what he'd meant was conditional. He said, "Then what do you want?" The simplicity of it caught her off guard. She was quiet for a long time, long enough that the first proper dark settled over the garden, and the stars multiplied above the ridge. She turned the question over, not performing consideration, actually conducting it. She had spent 17 years wanting things she could not name, because naming them had felt like a cruelty she could not afford to do to herself. "I want to know what my voice sounds like," she said finally, "when I'm not angry or afraid." She felt him go still beside her. "I've never heard that," she said. "Every sound I've made since yesterday it's been something. Fury or urgency or the specific effort of making a point in a courtyard full of people." She paused. "I want to know what it sounds like when it isn't doing anything important, when it's just existing." So she talked. She did not decide to. It simply happened the way water finds its level, the way things long held under pressure eventually surface. She talked the way someone talks who has had 17 years of noticing with nowhere to put any of it, and has just been handed, without warning, an audience that appears to be genuinely present. She talked about small things, about the way the torchlight in the great hall moved differently on feast nights, warmer, less even, the shadows more generous, about the senior wolves and the patterns she had catalogued across years, which ones were performing confidence and which ones actually had it, and how rarely those two categories overlapped. About a winter, 5 or 6 years ago, when an injured deer had somehow gotten into the eastern courtyard and stood there for an entire morning, while the pack debated what to do with it, and how the deer had seemed, to her observation, entirely unimpressed by the debate. She talked about a song. A kitchen worker had been humming it. Years ago, a woman who left Ashevale the following season for reasons no one explained. The melody had 3 phrases that repeated in a pattern Silvara had carried ever since, stored somewhere below language, below conscious thought. She had never been able to hum it herself. She had held it, unvoiced, for the better part of a decade. She hummed 4 bars of it now, quietly, into the cold garden air. Her voice cracked slightly on the 3rd note. She kept going. When she finished, the garden was very quiet. Dorvin had not moved beside her. His wolf, she somehow knew without looking, had been completely still for the entire time she'd been speaking. Not the taut stillness of restraint, but the deep stillness of something that has arrived somewhere it intended to be and has no reason to move. He had not offered commentary, had not redirected or summarized or reflected her words back at her in the way people do when they are performing listening rather than actually doing it. He had simply received everything she offered, without selection, without hierarchy, without deciding which parts were significant enough to respond to. She had not known, until this moment, how much she had needed that. The quiet settled between them, comfortable in a way quiet had never been for her. She had always lived in silence as a condition, a limitation, a thing imposed. This was different. This was the quiet of 2 people who had said enough, for now, and were at ease with the enough. Then she asked the question she had been carrying since the East Garden. "Did your family ever try to find me?" She felt him draw breath. Or did they try to find the bloodline? She turned to look at him then directly, the way she had looked at him across the courtyard that first morning, without adjustment or apology. She wanted to see his face when he answered. She had learned more from faces than from words her entire life, and she was not prepared to stop now. He met her eyes. He did not answer immediately. The pause was not evasion. It was the specific pause of a man who has been asked something precise and is deciding that precision deserves honesty rather than comfort. She watched him sit with the question, watched him resist the version of the answer that would have been easier to give, watched him arrive at the true one. His jaw tightened slightly, once. "I'll spend a long time," he said quietly, "making sure you know the difference." It was not a denial. It was not a promise dressed as one. It was an acknowledgement of the gap between what had been and what he intended, of the distance between a bloodline and a person, of the work that separating those 2 things would require. She nodded slowly. She looked back at the stars above the ridge. Her voice, when it existed in the cold air of the garden between sentences, between questions, between the small and careful beginnings of something neither of them had a name for, yet her voice, she thought, sounded like this. Not angry, not afraid, just present, just hers. Chapter 10. She asked for the assembly herself. That was the detail that moved through Ashvale's corridors before dawn, like a current not announced by council, not convened by the king's delegation. Not called by any authority, the pack had a framework for receiving. The request had come from Silvara, delivered through Feinrich, in plain language, without ceremony. She is asking that the pack and the delegation assemble in the Great Hall at mid-morning. She has something to say. The phrasing alone was enough to silence every room it entered. She has something to say, as if that were ordinary. As if a girl who had lived 17 years as furniture had simply decided, on a Tuesday morning, that she would like to be heard, and the world had rearranged itself around the decision without requiring her to justify it first. Perhaps, Silvara thought as she dressed in the gray light before the hour, that was exactly what had happened. She wore the same clothes. She had been offered, through a quietly mortified pack attendant, something more suitable for a formal address, something with structure, with the visual language of rank and occasion. She had declined without explanation. She had nothing against the offer. She simply understood that walking into that hall in borrowed clothing would be, in its own quiet way, a performance. And she was done performing things she hadn't chosen. She bound her left hand as she always did. Then she stopped, unwound the cloth, and left it on the table. Let it be visible. Let it be what it was. She was finished managing other people's comfort with her existence. The great hall was full when she arrived. Not the arranged fullness of a formal review, the organic fullness of a pack that had come because it needed to see what came next with its own eyes. They stood in loose clusters rather than rank formation, the careful hierarchy of the previous assembly loosened by the strangeness of the past 2 days into something more honest. Dorvin's delegation occupied the right side of the hall. The Ashvale wolves filled the left and center. Finric stood near the back with the expression of a man who has started something large and is now watching it move under its own momentum. Silvara walked to the center of the hall and stopped. She did not stand at the elder's traditional position at the head of the room. She did not use the raised platform or the formal speaker's position. She stood in the middle of the floor, at the same level as everyone else, in the space where the light from the high windows fell cleanest. She let the room settle. Then she spoke. "I know what I am," she began. Her voice was steadier than it had been in the courtyard. 2 days of use had worn the roughest edges down, and what remained had a quality she was still learning to recognize as simply her own. "I've had 2 days to read about it, think about it, and understand what it means for every person in this room." She looked across the assembled faces without flinching. "I also know what I am not." She paused. "I am not a instrument. I am not a claim to be filed or a bloodline to be managed or a political solution to a 4-century problem." Her eyes moved briefly to Dorvan's delegation, then back to the wider room. "That applies to everyone, to this pack, which erased me, and to the Iron Veil, which would restore me. The motivation is different. The shape of the mistake would be the same." The hall was very still. "The Lunarist legacy is mine. I am not disclaiming it." She held up her left hand, the sigil glowing softly in the morning light from the windows, calm and steady. No longer the startling revelation it had been 2 days ago, but simply a fact, visible and unhidden. "But what I do with it, and when, and how, that will be my decision. Made in my own time, in my own voice." She lowered her hand. "That is all I am here to say." No one spoke. No one applauded. No one moved to challenge or question or reframe. The hall simply received what she had said, with the particular silence of people who have understood something and are still in the process of understanding it. It was, Silvara thought, the best response she could have hoped for. Orethis was brought in after. 2 council members flanked her formal custody, not chains, not theater. She walked into the hall under her own power, with her silver hair still wound at the base of her neck, still wearing the charcoal robes she always wore. Whatever the past 2 days had cost her was visible only in the area around her eyes, and only if you knew what to look for. Silvara looked for it, and she found it. The pack had arranged itself in a loose ring, leaving the center of the floor to the 2 of them. Silvara was aware of what the room expected: the fury, the reckoning, the dramatic architecture of a wrong, finally answered with proportional force. She had felt the anticipation for it even before Orethis crossed the threshold. The room was braced to witness justice delivered at volume. She did not give them that. She looked at Orethis for a long moment, at this woman who had carried a terrible decision for 40 years and built a life on top of it, and told herself, over and over, in the language of the practical and the necessary, that the telling herself was the same as the truth. "You kept me alive," Silvara said, "when they ordered you not to." Orethis went very still. "I know that." Silvara's voice was even. Not warm, she was not performing warmth she didn't have. But not cold either, something more precise than either. "I know what it cost you to make that choice, and I know that you have spent 40 years making sure it never cost you anything again." She paused. "I don't forgive you for what you did to my voice. I want you to understand that clearly, not as cruelty, but as truth. What you took from me was not yours to take, and the years I spent living inside the silence you made are not returnable." Orethis's hands, at her sides, had begun to tremble. "But I understand it," Silvara said. "The fear of it, the logic of it. The way a person can confuse preservation with love and spend decades not examining the difference." She held the old woman's gaze. "And I will not let what you did to me define what I become, because that would mean you still have authorship over my life. And that ended yesterday." The first tear crossed Orethis's face with the particular quality of something that has been held back for an extremely long time and has simply run out of strength to stay. She did not speak. She did not ask for absolution or offer explanation or reach for any of the justifications Silvara knew she still carried. She simply stood in the center of the hall and wept quietly, with none of the composure she had spent 40 years perfecting, and let the verdict be what it was. Not forgiveness, not fury. Something harder than both, and more honest than either, being fully seen and being told exactly what that seeing found, by the one person whose seeing mattered most. They stood in the courtyard when it was over. Midday light, actual warmth in it for the first time in days, the kind that turned fresh snow luminous and made the Highland air feel briefly generous. The assembly had dispersed. The delegation was preparing for the administrative complexity that would occupy the coming weeks. Feinrich was somewhere inside, probably already thinking about what came next in the way that Feinrich always managed to be 3 steps into what came next before most people had finished with what was current. Silvara stood in the snow with her left hand at her side, the sigil glowing its soft and steady glow in the cold. Dorvin stood beside her. Not in front of her, not behind her. Beside. He was not kneeling. Neither of them was performing anything. There was no audience they were managing, no dynamic they were maintaining for the benefit of a watching room. There was just the courtyard, and the light, and 2 people standing at the same height, with the same view of an uncertain horizon. She looked at him. He looked back at her. "I don't know what I'm doing," she said, not as confession, as plain statement of fact, delivered with the same directness she had brought to everything since her voice came back. "I don't know how to be what yesterday said I am. I don't know the protocols or the politics or the history I'm apparently standing inside of." "No," he agreed. "And I'm not going to pretend otherwise to make the transition easier for the people managing it. I wouldn't ask you to." She was quiet for a moment. Then, with the slight upward shift at the corner of her mouth, that was, for Silvara, the full architecture of a smile. "I survived 17 years of silence," she said. The snow held the light from her palm and scattered it softly across the courtyard stones. "I think I can handle a future with a little noise." Dorvin said nothing. He didn't need to. The horizon was wide and unclear and entirely open, and for the first time in her life, Silvara looked at it without the feeling of a cage around the looking. Just possibility. Just hers. If Silvara's story moved you, if you've ever been told your silence meant you had nothing worth saying, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Tell us in the comments, what was your favorite moment in this story?